Thank you for joining us this evening. You are attending the webinar entitled Poems and Other Word Machines. Our leader for this session is Seth Perlow, Associate Professor of English, Georgetown University. And tonight's TA is actually going to be Deanna Gomez from Bloom Trail High School, Chicago Heights, Illinois. We also have another TA who was scheduled to attend, but unfortunately had a matter to come up, an emergency he had to attend to, so he will not be here with us this evening. But both are members of our Teacher Advisory Council who will be available and weighing in, at least Deanna will. Let's go ahead and get started. Seth Perlow is an Associate Professor of English at Georgetown University. His research focuses on American poetry, literature, and technology, media studies, and historical poetics. Perlow holds a PhD in English from Cornell University, an MA in Humanities from the University of Chicago, and an AB in Comparative Literature from Brown University. He is author of the poem Electric, Technology and the American Lyric, and editor of Gertrude Stein's Tender Buttons, the corrected Centennial Edition. In addition to his peer-reviewed scholarship, his essays about poetry and public culture have appeared in the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Review of Books, Public Books, and elsewhere. And I have to tell you all, it is indeed an honor to have Dr. Perlow with us tonight. I have been looking forward to this session since he and I first exchanged correspondence back in March of this year. So, Seth, thank you for joining us this evening. We're looking forward to your talk.
Thank you, Mike, and hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Before I get started, I'd like to thank Mike for the invitation to host the seminar tonight, as well as Raven Ferguson for the logistical support. And I also want to thank Deanna Gomez for her help as an advisor this evening. So the title of my talk, Poems and Other Word Machines, is intended to cast a wide net that covers a lot of my research and teaching. The title alludes to this quote from the American poet William Carlos Williams. He writes that, quote, "A poem is a small or large machine made of words." I'm afraid this will be nearly the last thing I say about Williams, but the question of poems, the equation of poems with machines, at least sort of gets us started here. In a lot of my teaching and research, I try to see how this statement of Williams's might be taken literally. What if we treat language, and especially writing, as a technology? What are the consequences if we view literature as a kind of machine? Now, a question like that, I think, can feel pretty abstract at first, so I want to start with a brief, concrete anecdote. This is the kind of thing that first got me interested in thinking about literature and technology together. It's a short poem that Emily Dickinson wrote in 1879. It's not one of her better known poems. I'll just read it here. "The way hope builds his house, it is not with a sill nor rafter has that edifice, but only pinnacle. Abode in as supreme this superficies as if it were of ledges smit or mortised with the laws." I think we could talk about this strange short poem all night, the personification of hope as a house builder, its religious significance. But instead, I just want to show you the manuscript, which looks like this. Dickinson wrote this poem on the back of an unfolded envelope, a piece of paper that looks kind of like a house. A manuscript like this opens all sorts of questions about how poems get written and interpreted. Did Dickinson choose to write a poem about a house and then go looking for a house-shaped piece of paper? Or did the shape of the envelope sort of guide her to the topic of the poem in the first place? The manuscript also leaves us in a tough spot as readers. Typeset editions of the poem, like you saw on the last slide, can't really show the page shape. They also regularize details like line breaks and punctuation. Notice that the first line of the poem, "The way hope builds his house," takes up 3 lines at the narrow top of the stationery here. Dickinson scholars have spent the past 40 years fiercely debating how to negotiate these complexities of her manuscripts when publishing her poems. So it still really is a live question in Dickinson studies. There's still real disagreement about this. So examples like this one raise some broader questions. How do language technologies influence what authors write, including technologies as simple as a piece of paper? How do writers negotiate these technological influences? How do our ways of publishing and reading literature affect what we think it means? And how do creativity, individuality, and intention survive these influences on our ways of writing and reading? That last question really is the crux of what I want to talk through today. So here's a quick roadmap of the rest of our time together. My overall goal is to consider how the technological dimensions of literature might affect our ideas about creativity, individuality, authenticity, and intention. I'll argue that the two bits of literary theory we've read, the essays by Roland Barthes and Stanley Fish, equip us to think critically about the mechanistic character of a poem. So we'll start with the theory and then move to the poems by Mullen, Alatalo, and Smith. As we'll see, these poems engage in various kinds of appropriation, borrowing words, phrases, and ideas from pre-existing texts. By reading them, we can road test the arguments that Barthes and Fish make. In the third part of the seminar, we'll address some texts that are more explicitly technological, focusing on Christopher Strachey's love letter generator and Jacob Gabri's essay about it. I'm sure everyone here is aware that computer-generated text has improved dramatically in recent years. It's been all over the newspapers, of course. It certainly has surprised me as a literary critic, even when focusing on technology, to be doing so much work on AI lately. Despite the novelty of these emerging language machines, I want to suggest tonight, first, that both literary theory and certain kinds of poetry anticipate the uncertainties raised by AI writing tools. And second, that by reading these texts attentively, we can begin to develop more interesting responses to them. In the last section of the seminar, I hope we'll have a little extra time for questions and discussion about the implications of these texts and technologies for literature classrooms. I'll say a little then about the two optional resources, which are more squarely focused on AI. So that's the plan. Before we dive into section one, I want to just acknowledge, since it's about literary theory, that theory can make for really difficult reading. I'm sure there's some people in the audience with ample experience in this area, and maybe with Barthes and Fish in particular. But for anyone who found these essays like bizarre and confusing, rest assured you are not alone. When I teach theory, I encourage my students to bring their confusion into the classroom and share it. Theory can be, I think, intellectually powerful because it gets us a little confused about things we thought were pretty straightforward. So, if you're befuddled, we'll work through it, and then we'll have poetry. So, to get started, Roland Barthes was a French literary theorist, best known for his contribution to the field of structuralist interpretation. This is his most famous essay that we read, The Death of the Author, which first appeared in 1967. In this essay, Barthes develops an account of literary text in relation to impersonality, which is a little counterintuitive. He anticipates Fish in showing how our very sense of being an individual may be instilled through a cultural structure that we do not choose or individually create. A language is something handed to us from others in our culture. The conclusion for Barthes is that because language is a shared mechanism for communicating, it's never a radically individualistic way of meaning. I use the same language as you do. That's how we're communicating right now. So even if I write a poem that seems to spill forth the most quirky individual thoughts and feelings, I am in fact operating a structure or mechanism that's not radically my own. Instead, I'm functioning within a machine that is quite social rather than personal. So in the first paragraph of the essay, Barthes suggests, quote, "Writing is the destruction of every voice, every point of origin. Writing is that neutral, composite, oblique space where our subject slips away, the negative where all identity is lost, starting with the very identity of the body writing." Barthes is saying that when we use language, we actually efface that sense of individuality. He questions the idea that when someone writes a poem, they express their innermost truth or spill forth some deeply personal, quite unique interiority. Barthes is pointing out that when you work in language, you work in a medium that effaces that interiority or that uniqueness, at least, precisely because language is an exteriority, right? It's public, not individual, but shared. Barth goes on to argue that the idea of an author is a kind of modern invention, a product of recent centuries. The modern idea of the author, he argues, functions as a way of grounding a literary text, a way of explaining the work based on its origin with a certain person. Barth wants to push back against this idea. On 143, he writes, quote, "It is language which speaks, not the author. To write is through a prerequisite impersonality to reach that point where only language acts," end quote. Maybe this sounds counterintuitive. It certainly did to me the first time I read it. But imagine what happens when you write something down and then, I don't know, leave it somewhere or publish it or give it to someone. When they read it on their own, it's not really you acting anymore, so much as the language kind of acting in your place. And you hope it works and does the thing you want it to do, but it might or might not. As a way of displacing this modern invention, the idea of the author, Barth introduces a competing idea, an alternative in the figure he calls the scripter. As he writes on page 145, quote, "The author is thought to nourish the book, but by contrast, the modern scripter is born simultaneously with the text," end quote. Author and scripter can be understood as like two ways of thinking of the person doing the writing. The author is almost like a god of the text, its creator, the organizer of its meanings and values. The scripter, by contrast, is just the person working a linguistic mechanism in a way that's more impersonal, not a situation of comprehensive mastery. So the scripter is an image of the person writing that doesn't carry with it all the baggage of individuality, inventiveness, radical creativity, or genius. And in that way, the scripter provides an alternative to the traditional conception of the author. For Barth, the scripter, as this sort of anonymous operator of the linguistic system, more closely reflects how language actually works. That, for him, is the major payoff, I think. So on 146, he writes, quote, "A text is not a line of words releasing a single theological meaning, but a multidimensional space in which a variety of writings, none of them original, blend and clash. The text is a tissue of quotations drawn from the innumerable centers of culture." We can think of this analogy of a text as a tissue of quotations in multiple registers, and doing so clarifies why Barth calls this space multidimensional. On one hand, we can think of a text we write as a tissue of quotations at the level of individual words or phrases. I write by choosing one word at a time, and I didn't make up any of the words. I learned and received them from our shared linguistic cultures. My reuse of them can be understood as a kind of a practice of quotation, right? But writing involves quotation at other levels as well. As I'm writing this lecture, for example, I have a received idea of what it means to write a lecture, how it should be structured, what it should contain. So at that level too, my choices are not like radically individual, but pre-trained by the rhetorical menu that I associate with lectures. The same goes for writing, let's say, a love letter. In that case, I am in some sense quoting other love letters. I'm rehearsing and cobbling together the rhetoric, the vocabulary, the metaphors, the structure that I know to be appropriate for a love letter. As we near the end of the Barth essay, he tells us that by displacing the author, this idea of the scripter puts readers in charge. The multiplicity of quotations and kinds of writing that unfold in a given text, these multidimensional quotations become focused, not at the site of the author, understood as a godlike creator and coordinator of meaning, but at the site of the reader, who activates the text by reading it. So on 148, we read, quote, "A text is made of multiple writings, but there is one place where this multiplicity is focused, and that place is the reader, not, as was hitherto said, the author. A text's unity lies not in its origin, but in its destination." And then this famous last sentence of the essay, "The birth of the reader must be at the cost of the death of the author." So the idea here, again, is that if writing is always a process of recombining non-original pieces of language, then the very idea of the author who spills forth unique interiority, their personal genius, that notion gets displaced by an idea of the scripter as a functionary or operator of language. A further consequence is the elevation of the reader as the site where meaning gets produced. So we get some challenging ideas here about impersonality, originality, and the structure of language in this essay. It might not yet be clear how this relates to an Emily Dickinson manuscript, but maybe it's already possible to anticipate how this connects with something like ChatGPT, with large language models or technologies for writing. So I want to pause here for questions, but first I'll flag one obvious question about Barth's elevation of the reader. And that question is, right, is he saying that texts mean whatever their readers say they mean? If authorship is not this idiosyncratic, highly individual mode of creativity, then maybe reading is, right? After this first break for questions, if there are any, Stanley Fish is going to tell us why the answer to this question is no. But I'll pause here to see if there are any questions so far.
Good deal. Thank you so much. And I will encourage everyone, again, if you should have any questions, feel free to place them in the Manage Q&A, and we will queue them up and have them ready. There's actually a question from Ryan that is in the Manage Q&A right now, Seth, and I will go ahead and go through it. It's probably visible to you as well right now. But and is there a text in this class? Fish raises and attempts to rebut the fear of solipsism by appealing to an interpretive community. Essentially, he argues that it's not true that in the absence of the controls afforded by a normative system of meanings, the self will simply substitute its own meanings for the meanings usually identified with the intentions of the author that texts bring with them. Because for Fish, texts do have meanings which are set not by authors, but by interpretive communities, which establish public and conventional meanings for texts. However, this does not imply that texts have objective meanings in the sense of meanings aligned with mind-independent reality, but only texts have intersubjective meanings, which is still completely mind-dependent. Do you agree with Fisher's reader response notion that texts can have no meanings beyond intersubjective meanings? No fully or robustly objective meanings at all. That was a mouthful. Thank you, Ryan, for that. And Seth, if you want to take that one on, or
absolutely,
will we?
Thank you for reading that. I mean, I won't speak at length to this because, in part because I think the discussion of Stanley Fish in just a moment will illuminate both a lot of the sense of the question and what's at stake.
For sure.
This final question, do you agree with Fish's reader response position? I mean, if the question is, do I personally agree with it, I honestly feel very ambivalent about it. I find it, like a lot of the theory I teach, I find it incredibly persuasive. But then when I read other essays that refute it, I find those refutations persuasive also. So that's a bit of a mealy-mouthed response, but yeah, I'm not entirely sure. I mean, the language here of mind-independent meanings, I think points at what really is at stake in Fish's argument, and at a dimension of Fish's argument that I very much do agree with, which is, I think a meaning is always a meaning in a mind, right? I mean, it's always a meaning for someone who's doing the interpreting or who's perceiving the meaning. And in that sense, I'm not sure. I think it makes sense to believe that there are any possibly mind-independent meanings. So I hope that's a coherent answer, and I think going into the Fish will and what I have to say about the Fish will further answer the question.
Good deal. Thank you for that. And yeah, we can move on into the last question there. Does the birth of reader mean that a text means whatever it is its reader thinks it means? I'm hanging on right now, and I would love to hear more about it. So looking forward to the next session. Again, everyone, place any questions that you have in the Managed Q&A. I see a few in the audience chat as well. So after we cover this section, please put those questions in the Managed Q&A if you'd like us to revisit them. Thank you so much, Seth.
Perfect. So let's talk Stanley Fish, who, unlike Roland Barthes, is still living. Fish is a literary theorist. He's written on a wide range of topics. He's sort of a contrarian figure in some of what he writes. And the most important topic he's covered for us has to do with the field of reader response theory, which, as the name suggests, this area is concerned with a reader's response to a text. So there's an obvious connection from where the Barthes essay ends, that is with the reader, to where Fish picks up questions about the reader. The title of Fish's essay, How to Recognize a Poem When You See One, is pretty strange, right? In the first paragraph, though, he gives us some important clues. He uses this term, interpretive communities, which is going to be crucial, and he introduces two key points right at the start. First, he claims that, quote, meanings are the properties neither of fixed and stable texts nor of free and independent readers, but of interpretive communities. And second, he wants us to use this idea, quote, to account not only for the meanings a poem might be said to have, but for the fact of its being recognized as a poem in the first place. Now, these two claims, like so much in literary theory, are, I think, not easy to understand at first. But some examples, I think, will start to clarify. These examples show us that Fish wants to think about the conditions for genre recognition. Before we get into Fish's examples about genre recognition and beyond, here's one example that I got from a grad school mentor and that I often share with students when we read this essay. When you watch TV, or maybe you're channel surfing or watching YouTube, anything with ads, think about how fast you can tell whether you're seeing an advertisement or an actual show. It often takes like less than a second to tell the difference. And advertisers, remember, are like trying to make us confuse their ads for shows so that we'll watch them more. But still, most people can usually tell the difference really, really fast. That's a kind of genre recognition. By genre here, I just mean like category or type, what kind of thing you're looking at. So in this case, something remarkably fast, implicit, complex, and really powerful is happening when we recognize an ad versus a TV show. That's genre recognition. So Fish starts by asking, how do you recognize that a poem is a poem? And he gives us a much weirder example, which is this story about a list of names he's written on the blackboard. It's a list of reading assignments for a class on linguistics and literary criticism. But then his next class comes into the same room, and this is a class on religious poetry. And he points to the list of names. He tells the class, hey, it's a poem, and asks them to interpret it. And they do a really good job of it. The list of names is found to have all sorts of poetic characteristics. And, you know, they make these clever, close readings that Fish tells us about. How is this possible? Fish's very counterintuitive answer is that when we recognize something for what it is, we are not seeing characteristics that exist independently in the object, but construing the object with a certain kind of attention. So on 326, he writes, quote, acts of recognition, rather than being triggered by formal characteristics, are their source. And he goes on, this is not on the slide, I think. It is not that the presence of poetic qualities compels a certain kind of attention, but that paying a certain kind of attention results in the emergence of poetic qualities, end quote. He says that his students look at the list of names with poetry-seeing eyes, and that is what leads them to see poetic qualities in the text. And on the next page, he writes, quote, skilled reading is usually thought to be a matter of discerning what is there, but it is a matter of knowing how to produce what can thereafter be said to be there. And this is what's on the slide here. Interpretation is not the art of construing, but the art of constructing. Interpreters do not decode poems, he writes, they make them, end quote. And again, a few pages later, he writes, quote, all objects are made and not found, and they are made by the interpretive strategies we set in motion, end quote. Now this, I have to say, is a pretty wild claim. Fish starts defending against various objections shortly after making it. The best objection is simply that if you get clever enough, you can twist and distort a text that means one thing into meaning another, but it's still a distortion. So like, okay, Stanley Fish, you've got some really clever students there, but in fact, they were just sort of misreading an assignment. The list is really just a list of names. But Fish responds to this objection, quote, the assignment we see is no less the product of interpretation than the poem into which it was turned, end quote. In other words, it's not like there's some quality in the list of names that makes it be a reading assignment. You have to already know all sorts of culturally variable facts in order to construe it as a reading assignment. What a class is, what a reading is, what homework assignments are, what authors are. All of this knowledge has to be already operative in order for you to see an assignment as an assignment. So here too, it's by looking with assignment-seeing eyes that we seem to see the characteristics of an assignment already there in the list of names. And then we say, aha, it's an assignment. As a quick aside here, in this part of the essay around page 332, where Fish starts to indicate, this is where Fish starts to indicate that our sense of ourselves as individuals, as subjective entities, is also socially constructed. This is a more challenging idea, but it's one we'll come back to in just a second. First, I just want to mention one more example that Fish offers to drive home this idea that genre recognition and interpretation generally are not grounded in the characteristics of the object itself, nor in the highly subjective views of an individual, but rather in the social systems he calls interpretive communities. One further example is his student's raised hand. How do we know that the student is asking permission to speak and not pointing to the lights or hailing a taxi or stretching? Here's how Fish answers that question on 333. Quote, "It is neither the case that the significance of Mr. Newland's gesture is imprinted on its surface where it need only be read off, or that the construction put on the gesture by everyone in the room was individual and idiosyncratic. Rather, the source of our interpretive unanimity was a structure of interests and understood goals, a structure whose categories so filled our individual consciousness that they were rendered as one, immediately investing phenomena with the significance they must have, given the already in place assumptions about what someone could possibly be intending." Often we might experience the meaning of something like a raised hand in a classroom as self-evident, but in fact, the social contexts in which we live enable us to make sense of it. That's really his point. The big so what here is basically a restatement of the first point. When we interpret a text or a raised hand or something else in the world, we do not have any kind of totally objective pre-cultural way to look at the object's attributes in isolation. So the meaning of an object does not come purely from its characteristics, nor from our purely subjective ideas about it, but from the interpretive communities that both inhabit and that teach us how to look at it, at anything. Although Fish does not refer to Roland Barthes or the death of the author, it should be clear that these two essays have some interests in common. As theories of interpretation, they both remind us that language is something we share. It's created not by individuals, but by communities. You'll recall that Barthes announces the death of the author and the birth of the reader as a site where a text's meaning gets actualized. But after reading Fish's essay, it should be clear that the birth of the reader does not indicate that a text means whatever each individual reader says it means. Rather, Fish underscores how fundamentally the meaning of a text depends upon interpretive communities, upon the social contexts in which the text gets interpreted. Before we pause again to see if there are any questions, there's one more stage in Fish's argument that I'd like to address. After illustrating the importance of interpretive communities for making sense of a poem or an assignment or a raised hand, Fish then challenges us to follow a similar line of thought about ourselves as subjects. He's already pointed out that cultural systems provide us with the categories and the interpretive habits that enable us to make sense of the world. And then on 332, he writes, quote, "Insofar as the system constrains us, it also fashions us, furnishing us with categories of understanding with which we in turn fashion the entities to which we can then point. In short, to the list of made or constructed objects, we must add ourselves, for we, no less than the poems and assignments we see, are the products of social and cultural patterns of thought." End quote. By the time we get to the end of this quotation, Fish is not just saying that our communities determine how we interpret the world, but also that our communities determine how we construct ourselves as people. So let's unpack what this means for interpretation. Fish argues not only that we don't need to worry about highly individual, super personal, and subjective interpretations, since interpretation is socially grounded, but also that such idiosyncratic interpretation is actually not possible. A few pages later on 335, Fish writes, quote, "No one's interpretive act," this is not on the slide, but I think later quotation is, quote, "No one's interpretive acts are exclusively his own, but fall to him by virtue of his position in some socially organized environment, and are therefore always shared and public," end quote. And then skipping down to the last sentence of that paragraph, quote, once one realizes that the conceptions that fill consciousness, including any conception of its own status, are culturally derived, the very notion of an unconstrained self, of a consciousness wholly and dangerously free, becomes incomprehensible, end quote. The first consequence here is that it may be impossible to interpret something in a totally individual, idiosyncratic way. That resolves any anxieties about the anarchy of everyone having their own personal interpretation of a text. But the second consequence, which I found really remarkable, is that even my idea of myself as a unique individual with free, unconstrained, subjective thoughts, even that idea itself is socially produced and learned. When I teach this essay to undergraduates, I like to pause here for a second and linger with this point, even though it's not primarily a point about literature. But it's a sort of mind-blowing idea to me. Basically, all of us have been told, or most of us, I guess, that we are unique, idiosyncratic, individual people with our own subjective positions unlike any others. We're taught to believe and usually to value this point. But ironically, we're basically all taught to value this same proposition about ourselves. In other words, the idea that there's no one quite like me, that idea itself might be the single least unique idea I have, since it's an idea almost everyone has about themselves. Now, Fish goes on from here to develop a fairly ambitious claim that the opposition between objectivity and subjectivity itself doesn't make a lot of sense. I'm going to avoid that part of the argument because it seems a little beside the point for our purposes tonight. We've got basically two ideas from Fish that will inform what we do next. The first is this idea that the meanings of texts are grounded not in the objects themselves, nor in our individual subjectivities, but in the norms of interpretive communities. And the second, which we'll come back to later, is the idea that our own subjective experiences and our sense of ourselves as individuals is also constructed through the same social processes. So with that, we are finished with the theory for the session, and I thought maybe we could pause here to see if there are any further questions.
And thank you for that, Seth. Again, just a reminder, I see that there's several conversations going on in the audience chat right now. Thank you all so much for your engagement. And if there should be any questions, please enter them in the managed Q&A or in the Q&A at the appropriate times. But aside from there, we are good on time, Seth, so we can continue on. If there are questions, I will bring them to your attention.
Okay, great. So on to the poetry. The poems I wanted to discuss today are all recent, all published since the year 2000. Before turning to those, I wanted to mention just two more or less randomly chosen precursors in order to acknowledge that poets have been experimenting with the technological aspects of their work for a really long time. The first of these examples is a poem called Easter Wings by the British poet George Herbert, first published way back in 1633. I'm not going to read this poem aloud. I just want to point out that it's shaped like angels' wings. This work joins a tradition of calligrams, also known as pattern poems or shape poems, that reaches back to ancient Greek and Arabic sources and forward to experiments in a movement called concrete poetry, which is more recent and international in a really interesting way. The other precursor I'll mention is by the French experimental writer Raymond Queneau. It's a book called 100,000 Billion Poems, originally published in 1961. This book has an element of recombination that anticipates some of the poetry we're about to read, and also maybe some emerging AI technologies. To make this book, Queneau wrote 10 different sonnets, each with the same rhyming sounds at the ends of their respective lines, so that a given line from one sonnet could be substituted into another sonnet without disrupting the poem's form. The 10 sonnets are published in a book with each line on a separate strip of paper, so they look like this sort of crazy fringe, as you can see in the picture there. It's an incredibly awkward book to handle, to try and turn pages and so forth, as you can imagine, but it enables you, in theory, to combine the lines from any of the 10 sonnets, which apparently makes a total of 100,000 billion different poems. There's a URL for an online version in French and English here on the slide. It's also findable on the book's Wikipedia page if you're interested in learning more about this very weird book. Anyway, because these three poems we have for discussion this evening are all by Americans and all published fairly recently, I wanted to mention these two precursors just as a way of gesturing toward the much longer, broader history of poetic experimentation with the technological affordances of writing and print, and the idea of shuffling and recombining language that can be generative. So now, I've been saying three poems, but in fact, I asked you to read four, the first of which was William Shakespeare's Sonnet 130. This is a pretty famous poem. Even if you've never read it before, you've probably at least heard the first line. I've included it here as a kind of preamble to the poem by Harriet Mullen for reasons that will become pretty obvious. So I'll start by reading the Shakespeare, Sonnet 130. My mistress' eyes are nothing like the sun. Coral is far more red than her lips red. If snow be white, why then her breasts are dun. If hairs be wires, black wires grow on her head. I have seen roses damasked red and white, but no such roses see I in her cheeks. And in some perfumes is there more delight than in the breath that from my mistress reeks. I love to hear her speak, yet well I know that music hath a far more pleasing sound. I grant I never saw a goddess go. My mistress, when she walks, treads on the ground. And yet by heaven I think my love as rare as any she belied with false compare. Now before I read Mullen's companion poem, I just want to point out the fact, which surprises most of my students, that this famous love poem by the great William Shakespeare is actually full of insults. Although Shakespeare ends up praising his love at the end, he first insults her hair, her complexion, her bad breath, her clumsiness, and so on. So having noted that weird fact about the poem's rhetorical structure, I'll turn to Harriet Mullen's response. In case you've heard of Shakespeare but not Mullen, I'll first say a little bit about her. She's a contemporary poet born in the 1950s in Alabama, and is now a professor of English and creative writing at UCLA, so local to a lot of our participants tonight. Mullen has written several influential books of experimental poetry. She started publishing books in the 90s, but this poem, Dim Lady, comes from what I think is one of her best books. It's called Sleeping with the Dictionary, which appeared in 2002. It's a really great book, definitely worth checking out. So here is Dim Lady. My honey bunch's peepers are nothing like neon. Today's special at Red Lobster is redder than her kisser. If liquid paper is white, her racks are institutional beige. If her mop were Slinky's, dishwater Slinkies would grow on her noggin. I have seen tablecloths in Shakey's pizza parlors, red and white, but no such picnic colors do I see in her mug. And in some minty fresh mouthwashes, there is more sweetness than in the garlic breeze my main squeeze wheezes. I love to hear her rap, yet I'm aware that Muzak has a hipper beat. I don't know any Marilyn Monroes. My ball and chain is plain from head to toe. And yet, by gosh, my scrumptious Twinkie has as much sex appeal for me as any lanky model or platinum movie idol who's hyped beyond belief. One thing I love about this poem is that I think it invites readers who are maybe new to poetry to feel a little less intimidated about Shakespeare's fancy language. At one level, Mullen is, of course, undertaking precisely the same rhetorical strategy that Shakespeare does. That is, she begins by enumerating all the superficial ways that her honey bunch is not conventionally attractive, her wiry hair, her garlicky breath, and all the rest. And then, again, like Shakespeare, she turns at the very end and says, nonetheless, I find my honey bunch more appealing than the sexiest movie star. When we were talking about Roland Barthes, you'll recall that moment when he says that writing is a tissue of quotations, a multi-dimensional space. I think the correspondence between Mullen and Shakespeare here gives a nice illustration of what multidimensional can mean. Mullen does not really quote Shakespeare's language directly. Very few of the distinctive words like mistress or coral or perfume get repeated in Mullen's poem. But at other levels, specifically in her imagery and her rhetoric, Mullen is quoting Shakespeare directly. The parallels between these poems can illustrate the more expansive sense of quotation that Barthes wants to give us. I've already mentioned the rhetorical echo, the derogation of the beloved followed by praise, but there's also parallel imagery. For Shakespeare's mistress eyes, nothing like the sun, Mullen's are nothing like neon. For coral, far more red than her lips in Shakespeare, we get the red special at Red Lobster in Mullen. For perfume and reeky breath in Shakespeare, we get the wonderfully assonant garlic breeze my main squeeze wheezes in Mullen. I just love that phrase. So at the level of imagery too, Mullen proceeds by maintaining a close correspondence with the Shakespeare, only putting a modern twist on each term. To my ear, these modern twists produce a slightly awkward mood in the Mullen. The presence of such things as neon and slinkies and muzak leads me to expect a sort of more natural contemporary atmosphere, a language similar to how we talk today. But that's not what Mullen actually gives us. No one these days talks with a straight face about my honey bunch's peepers. Words like mug and noggin and main squeeze and ball and chain have similarly modern but awkward effects. My first impulse is to claim that by comparison, Shakespeare's poem does not contain such awkward formulations, but I'm not sure I can say that. The truth is, when I judge any given line from the Shakespeare sonnet for how stilted or idiomatic it sounds, I find these judgments complicated by just how famous and familiar and, how old the sonnet is. Some of the phrasing sounds old-fashioned, but again, unlike Mullen's poem, this one's over 400 years old. In that time, phrases like my mistress' eyes have become so deeply entrenched in our shared linguistic and literary heritage that it's not clear to me what it would even mean to say they sounded awkward if they did. So going back to the Mullen text, there's another kind of quotation that fascinates me here, and that's her use of artificial, culturally specific objects to structure her comparisons. Shakespeare's sonnet is full of natural objects, coral, roses, the sun, and, luckily for Shakespeare, these have not changed that much from his time to ours. We still know what they are and what they're like. By contrast, Mullen gives us liquid paper, slinkies, red and white tablecloths. These items contribute to the poem's humor, of course. There's something basically unserious about liquid paper and slinkies. By putting this stuff into the poem, Mullen takes Shakespeare's version down a peg or two, making it a little bit goofy and deflating its fanciness a bit. There's something maybe intentionally cringy about some of the phrasing too, at least as I read it. Again, phrases like main squeeze or honey bunch. And while roses are a pretty timeless kind of thing to put into a love poem, liquid paper has a shelf life. As I teach this poem year after year, I get more and more worried that my students don't actually know what liquid paper is. Slinkies and Twinkies and Red Lobster may be more familiar for now, but it's not clear that readers in 400 years will have any idea what these things are. When Barth tells us that a text is a tissue of quotations drawn from innumerable centers of culture, we might think of the way that Mullen's poem draws not only from Shakespeare's for its rhetorical structure and its imagery, but also from the names of office supplies and fast casual restaurants of the late 20th century United States. One last comment about the Mullen poem before we look at the Alatalo. In my classes about poetry, I like to ask questions about poems that I genuinely don't know the answer to, because I think it makes poetry a little less intimidating for students if they know it's all right to find a poem confusing or to not be sure about something. And when it comes to this Mullen poem, one of my main uncertainties has to do with form. The poem is quite obviously in conversation with Shakespeare's sonnet 130, but Mullen's poem is not a sonnet. Instead of 14 lines in rhyming iambic pentameter, Mullen gives us a prose poem. There's some rhythmic play and certainly some rhyme, but it's not in verse, no line breaks. I'm not entirely sure why it's not in verse, what the decision to work in prose does for Mullen here. I've talked about the multiple registers at which she echoes and reworks the Shakespeare poem, and she produces maybe a similar tension at the level of form. Her decision to write a prose instead of a sonnet means something, but I'm not actually totally sure what, and I'm frankly curious if other folks might have ideas about this. So before we talk about the poems by Alatalo and Smith, I'll pause here to see if there are additional questions.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. We will... Okay, yeah, there's a question. Do you think that a writer is no more than a kind of conduit through which currents of meaning move passively, or can a writer, without being an ultimate and independent subject, actively contribute to a creative process by being a distinct function within a larger system?
I think that's a great question. Again, I
Mm,
don't think I have definitive answers. I will say that,
mhm,
as everyone in the audience probably knows, certainly as I know, um, what it feels like to be a writer is not to be simply a passive conduit. It is hard to write well.
mm,
It is not easy. So, I think that it's important to remember as teachers, but also as writers ourselves, the effortfulness of what we're doing. And I also, although although I think both Bart and Fish give us a reminder that in writing and in interpreting, more or less anything, we are acting as people embedded in interpretive communities, right, in social and cultural structures. Um, it's true that I prefer the work of some writers over other. At the end of the day, probably think some writers are certainly more talented than I am as a writer, and so there must indeed be something about the individual people doing the writing. And of course, there also certainly is there's the what it's like to be a person, right? To experience the world in a subjective way. And I don't think actually that Fish means to discount the importance of those things. He rather just wants to remind us that when we do these things, and I think Mullen is reminding us this too, we're doing these things always within a social context, and it's that social context that really enables us to even know what writing or what a poem might possibly be. The question of what it is then to create something new from such a situation, and the kind of effort and maybe the kind of talent necessary to do that is, that's a mystery for maybe everyone. But thank you for the question.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. And Ryan extends his thanks for answering his question. So we're fine to move ahead. Thank you again for responding to that question.
I did see one other question in the chat about corporate sponsorship. I have not received any money from Red Lobster for this evening's seminar. If anyone would like to get Red Lobster in touch with me, that'd be great. But it is pretty funny how much branding there is in that poem. She does that a lot, actually. Okay, so the poems by Alatalo and Smith also engage in strategies of appropriation and revision, as Mullins does. But unlike Mullen, these other poems work by direct quotation of pre-existing texts. So they're literalizing Bart in even more directly than Mullen does. The Alatalo reading is actually a collection of 4 short poems excerpted from a longer work called Unforeseen Alliances. I confess I don't know a lot about Alatalo. The internet says she was born in 1960 and is currently a professor in the writing program at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. In addition to Unforeseen Alliances, it looks like she's developed some other interesting work with textual collage and appropriation, as well as some work on eco-poetics and photography that's actually very interesting. So that's Alatalo. I'll go ahead and read these 4 from the series Unforeseen Alliances. The language of love. Love letters carried away pretty Polly. The language of love betrayed heart's desire. Home at last. Rooms of the heart. Beyond the picket fence, this is the house where love dwells. Storm warning. You only love once when lightning strikes. Lightning strikes twice. You only love twice. Where roses grow wild. The cowboy and the lady walk in the moonlight where roses grow wild. Listen for the whisper in their footsteps. Love's sweet music dancing on the wind. Now, my approach to teaching these poems is one of the very few cases where I intentionally withhold information from my students. After reading the poems aloud, I first ask the class what they notice about them, their tone, their word choice, what kind of poetry this seems to be. We usually find ourselves imagining little stories about love and family life based on each of the poems. So, for example, in the case of Storm Warning, students note the interesting symmetry of you only love once when lightning strikes, followed by the second strophe where lightning strikes twice, you only love twice. I don't know, maybe this can be read as a dramatic warning. Call it a storm warning to or from someone who's about to fall in love a second time, perhaps even with the same person. Eventually, someone usually mentions that the language in Alatalo's poems is maybe a little cliche, a little over the top. Whenever that comment comes, I dramatically reveal the withheld information, a fact about these poems that is not evident in the text itself. These poems are composed entirely from the titles of Harlequin-type romance novels. Each title and each line of the poems here is the title of a different novel. So The Language of Love is a novel, and Love Letters is a novel, and Carried Away is the title of a novel, and so forth. This is a kind of poetry by means of collage or assemblage, where the poet sticks found language together in an interesting way to create a new poem. From one point of view, it's a technique really specific to certain avant-garde schools of poetry, to which I would say Alatalo belongs. But if you've just read Bart and Fish, you're already thinking about how all writing, and indeed all cultural practices, more generally involve borrowing from and reworking what's come before. While the Mullen poem imitates the rhetorical structure and the imagery of Shakespeare's sonnet, Alatalo's poems quote other texts directly, using exactly the same words and phrases. This strategy of direct quotation does not, however, put Alatalo's poems into a simpler or closer kind of relation with the source texts. For one thing, note that many readers can identify Mullen's allusion to the Shakespeare sonnet without having it pointed out to them. You could just, if you know the Shakespeare sonnet, you can just read the Mullen poem and you know what she's up to, right? By contrast, I think it would be far more difficult to detect the sources of Alatalo's language, or even to know she's doing a practice of collage without someone pointing it out. And in fact, in the anthology where I found these poems, there's a sort of head note prefacing them that explains what I've explained to you. So weirdly, the poems that involve more direct quotation here are harder to place in relation to their source material than the poem that more loosely riffs on its source. I also find it much harder to specify the tone of Alatalo's poems in relation to their source material, Alatalo's attitude. It's tempting, I think, to believe that they're primarily making fun of their sources. If you look at the lines of the poems as the titles of books, they're a bit saccharine, sort of embarrassing in their sentimentality. But I think there's more than just parody here. Alatalo's ability to string these titles together into grammatical sentences with coherent themes, such that each poem does seem more or less to maybe be about something, is impressive. That effect of coherence reflects a certain kind of skill on Alatalo's part, right? She's a great scripter, Bart might say. Also, her work opens some interesting questions about the relations between literary genres. She's taking language from one genre, that is popular fiction, romance novels, and she's not just appropriating it to make more popular fiction. She's also transporting and sculpting it into a different literary genre, the genre of poetry. And as you may have heard, poetry is itself a genre famous for being cringy, embarrassing, full of romantic cliches and overwrought language. So we might initially think, hey, Alatalo is making these collages of romance novel titles in order to make fun of how corny romance novels are. But given that Alatalo is making poems, she's funneling this language into a genre where all this cringy imagery and emotionally overdone phrasing is actually kind of expected. Maybe she's embarrassing herself as a poet, or poetry in general, as much as she's embarrassing the romance novelists. Although again, like what there is to be embarrassed about here is a question. There's also more to be said here about the gender politics of Alatalo's work with romance novels, among other dimensions of these poems. But I'll transition now to the Smith poem before we pause again for any questions. So Tracy K. Smith is a poet from Massachusetts. Among her many other accomplishments, she's served 2 terms as the U.S. Poet Laureate, and she's a professor at her alma mater, Harvard University. The poem we're reading today, Declaration, appears in Smith's 2018 collection, Wade in the Water. I think this book as a whole is absolutely incredible. Again, very much worth checking out. Declaration is one of several poems in the book that uses collage techniques with found language to work through the histories of racial violence and oppression in the United States. A major strength of this work is it shows that techniques of collage and appropriation are not simply playful or weird amusements of the literary avant-garde. They can also convey very significant political messages. Before I read declaration, I should apologize for the awkward layout of the text on the slide. I had to split the poem in half here to make it fit. I did my best to get the page design right in the reading version I distributed to you. It's also available online and, of course, in the book Wade in the Water, which I recommend. So with that caveat, I'll read declaration. He has sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people. He has plundered our, ravaged our, destroyed the lives of our, taking away our, abolishing our most valuable, and altering fundamentally the forms of our. In every stage of these oppressions, we have petitioned for redress in the most humble terms. Our repeated petitions have been answered only by repeated injury. We have reminded them of the circumstances of our emigration and settlement here, taken captive on the high seas to bear. So we again have a poem made by collaging found language, but this one is also a really powerful, I think, moving statement about race, politics, and identity in the United States. When I teach poetry, I like to start by stating the obvious, again, partly as a way to make poems seem more approachable. So to state the obvious here, Smith has written this poem by selecting and rearranging phrases from the United States Declaration of Independence. And the central drama of the poem is that Smith takes language originally written by the Founding Fathers to complain about their mistreatment by the British Crown, and she reworks this language so that it reads as a protest about Black people's oppression in the United States, the legacies of enslavement and racist violence that still inform our culture and politics today. So that's the core of the poem, I think. One privilege of teaching at a place like Georgetown is that I usually have at least one student in the class who is not from the United States and therefore maybe doesn't get the connection to the Declaration of Independence. It might actually be that some younger students also would not catch the reference. That difference between recognizing the source text and not, which, I try to have that play out in class, right? That difference underscores the power of what Stanley Fish calls interpretive communities. We all belong to various social groups, national, regional, racial, and otherwise. And socializing within these groups equips us with various kinds of knowledge that we use to interpret the world around us, including whatever we read. Much of the knowledge we carry around like this is really implicit, as Fish shows us, not something we think about in a conscious way. Think again of how quickly you can spot an ad on YouTube or on TV, right? It's a lot of implicit knowledge there. When it comes to the Smith poem, we might start by talking about the knowledge of American history that readers need in order to link this poem with the Declaration of Independence. But I often go from there to ask students what other knowledge from interpretive communities, what other social contexts equip us to make sense of this poem. One important answer is that to have this poem mean what it means, we also rely upon knowledge about the calls for racial justice from Black Lives Matter and related social movements, criticism of police violence, and other contemporary anti-racist discourse. Keep in mind, this poem was published in 2018, just to give you a sense of its age. So in order to read swarms of officers to harass our people or taken captive, to read phrases like these and connect them with 21st century calls for racial justice and with the legacy of enslavement requires another kind of pre-existing knowledge that informs how we approach and make sense of the text. Knowing about the Declaration of Independence alone is not enough. I also think this poem is great for thinking about intentionality. Whose intentions does the text reflect? Of course, at one level, it reflects the intentions of Tracy K. Smith, since she's the one who chose to write a poem by rearranging phrases from the Declaration of Independence. On the other hand, the whole point of her strategy is that Smith did not actually choose these words and phrases herself. They were primarily chosen by Thomas Jefferson, whom the Committee of Five charged with drafting the Declaration of Independence in June of 1776. Other members of the committee and the Continental Congress edited the draft, so it's possible that some of these words and phrases originate not just with Jefferson, but from that collaborative process. So even before Smith's intervention, the text is the product of a kind of collective intention or a group. Of course, Smith introduces a really powerful counterpoint. On one hand, you have several dozen white men, the majority of whom actually owned enslaved people. And these guys write one of the most famous documents ever to claim that all men are created equal, an obviously hypocritical claim given the gendered language and, of course, the practice of slavery and other exclusionary norms of their time. And then, on the other hand, you have Smith, a Black woman whose basic humanity and rights these authors would not have recognized. She reworks their language so that it calls out the very injustices carried out in the name of the nation that the source document actually founded. For me, one of the major benefits of tracing this exchange is it shows that when we say that all language is borrowed and reworked, that writing is a tissue of quotations, statements like that can feel a little bit empty, not really politically salient or charged in much of any way. Smith gives us a powerful reminder that practices of collage and reappropriation can have really intense political energies too, and I would say also emotional energies. I haven't said much about the details of Smith's text, but one thing I'd like to point out before we pause for any questions is how fragmented the poem feels. Especially through the use of dashes and incomplete sentences, Smith gives a feeling of interruption or silencing or being cut off in the very effort to enunciate the grievances she recounts. And maybe at a formal level, that rhythm of fragmentation illustrates the much longer pattern of silencing and cutting short that has attended the history of anti-Black violence and oppression in this country. So it's an interesting formal choice. Obviously, there's a lot more that could be said about this poem, but I'll just pause here to see if there are further questions before we move to the section about artificial intelligence.
Good deal. Thank you for that. Yeah, in the interest of time, we can move into the section. And I guess in the last few minutes, if there are any questions remaining, we can bring them to your attention at that time.
Okay.
So we're fine with moving ahead. Thank you.
Great. Okay, so we'll turn now to the third and last real full section of the seminar, which I gave a slightly fancy title, in silico. This is a Latin phrase for something that is done inside a computer. So if biologists do experiments in vitro, meaning in glass, the computer simulations are done in silico on a computer's silicon chip. So that's the title. My goal in this section is to connect some of the ideas we've already discussed about language, literature, and interpretation with computers and with today's large language models. I first became interested in AI for teaching rather than research. A few years ago, I decided to design a class called Cultures of Artificial Intelligence. It was primarily a course on like stories we tell about AI. So we did movies like Terminator 2 and Her, science fiction by Ted Chiang and Ray Bradbury, as well as some theory and philosophy of mind about machine learning and consciousness. The class also had a short unit on a weird little program called GPT-2. Of course, in the years since then, GPT-2 has turned into GPT-3 and ChatGPT and GPT-4 and so on, and here we are. Rather than focus on large AI models today, I wanted to share some texts about the earlier history of computing. I hope these will enable us to make connections between the poetry and theory we've just discussed and the broader issues that today's emerging language technologies open up. I also want to mention there are two optional readings that I included for the seminar. One of those is a short article about AI and the humanities that I recently published in PMLA. The other is a YouTube video giving a fairly detailed explanation of how a large language model actually works. I'm not going to say much about these materials in the time we have left since they were optional, but I'll try to gesture in the direction at the end. So the first of the texts for us to focus on is a work of computer art called Love Letters, created in 1952 by Christopher Strachey. Before I tell you about Strachey, I just want to point out the image here on the current slide. This is a picture of the Manchester Mark I computer built at the University of Manchester in England in the late 1940s. The device was over 7 feet tall. It weighed several thousand pounds, and as you can see, occupied basically an entire room. This is the computer on which Strachey and his colleagues, including Alan Turing, did some of the earliest computer programming, including the creation of the Love Letters algorithm. So this is Christopher Strachey, born in Hampstead, England in 1916. His parents were part of the famous Bloomsbury group of writers and intellectuals, which included the likes of Virginia Woolf, John Maynard Keynes, and Christopher's uncle, Lytton Strachey. Although Christopher was apparently not a very distinguished student, he ended up making really significant contributions to the early development of computer science. He and the famous Alan Turing were at Cambridge University at the same time, and the two met again in Manchester in the 1950s. As you may know, Turing was persecuted for his homosexuality, which contributed to his apparent suicide at only 41 years old. As we'll discuss later, Strachey was also gay, although he did not suffer the same degree of at least governmental persecution that Turing did. In addition to his contributions to basic programming, Strachey made several early innovations in computer games and computer-generated art. The work we looked at today, Love Letters, is an early example, arguably the first example of computer-generated literature. Love Letters is a small computer program that generates, well, love letters. I'll read a few of them, starting with the one that Strachey cites in a 1954 article about his work. Darling sweetheart, you are my added fellow feeling. My affection curiously clings to your passionate wish. My liking yearns for your heart. You are my wistful sympathy, my tender liking. Yours beautifully, M.U.C. So the M.U.C. at the end there stands for Manchester University Computer, the big device we saw earlier. I'll now read a few more that were generated by Nick Monfort's re-implementation of love letters in Python. By the way, apologies if anyone had trouble with the link originally provided for a different web-based version of this program. It was down for a while, now seems back up again, but anyway, I'm going to focus on the Nick Monfort implementation, which has stayed up consistently. So here are a couple more outputs from Monfort's version. Darling Moppet, my ambition thirsts for your fervor. You are my wistful heart, my darling love. You are my sympathetic longing. My desire fervently is wedded to your curious passion. You are my impatient adoration, my covetous yearning. My liking fervently yearns for your infatuation. You are my avid ardor. My devotion anxiously holds dear your infatuation. Yours winningly, M.U.C. And then this one. Honey love, my devotion beautifully adores your anxious fondness. My sympathetic enchantment seductively wants your heart. My enchantment wistfully holds dear your yearning. My devoted charm fondly treasures your hunger. You are my adorable eagerness. My hunger winningly tempts your lust. You are my affectionate rapture, my tender fellow feeling. You are my fond enthusiasm, my amorous thirst. Yours fervently, M.U.C. I have to start by saying I find these letters both endearing and pretty funny. Every time the algorithm opens a letter with Darling Moppet, I have to stifle a giggle. Sometimes it opens with Dear Duck, which is maybe even better. I'll quickly give two different explanations of how the program generates these texts. First, a high-level way to understand the program. It starts by selecting two words from two different vocabulary lists for salutations. That's how we get Darling Moppet or the like. Next, it randomly chooses one or another sentence structure, one shorter, the other longer. I'll say I'm simplifying here a little bit. And then it fills in the sentence with nouns, verbs, adjectives, and adverbs from lists of words provided in the program. It is like Mad Libs, as somebody commented. It repeats this second step, choose a structure and fill it in 5 times. And then it closes by selecting one more adjective to put after yours and signs M.U.C. You can see all the Python code for this if you click Python at the top of the website. The second way of explaining this is that I just want to show some of Monfort's Python code itself, which you can see in the screenshots here. I'm not going to read through the whole program, partly because we don't have time and partly because my own understanding of Python is pretty basic. But just to illustrate partially, the bit of code on the left shows a few of the word lists. The one called first is the menu of 4 words that can start the letter, and the list called second is the menu of 4 words that can come next. So you can have darling duck, darling love, dear moppet, and so forth. Below that is the start of the list of adjectives, but that's just part of that list. And then on the right, we have the definition of 2 functions. One is called maybe, which half the time selects a random word from a given list and half the time just adds a space to the sentence instead. The other function is called longer, and it constructs a longer sentence form, starting with the word my, followed by maybe an adjective, then definitely a noun, then maybe an adjective, then definitely a verb, and so forth. So rather than go farther with code analysis, I want to pause here and recall the quotation we started with this evening, William Carlos Williams saying, a poem is a small or large machine made of words. This love letter generator is quite literally a machine made of words. Although it might not count as poetry, it produces another familiar genre of writing, the love letter. and it does so through a very logical, basically mechanical process. The Manchester Mark I computer does not have the ability to love, of course, and the love letters it generates are pretty formulaic and slightly goofy. But because of these traits, Strachey's program can teach us a lot, not only about language, but maybe about love as well. For one thing, some of the randomly generated phrases and sentences in these letters are kind of endearing. If anyone wrote me a love letter that started "Darling Moppet" and signed off with "Yours winningly," I'd be kind of impressed with the quirkiness of it, right? So before we get to Gabriel's reading of Strachey, I want to suggest that the love letter generator points us in two directions, helping us make connections of the sort I mentioned earlier. On one hand, Strachey's program is a very early chapter in the history of software that generates language. Although it's certainly not an example of machine learning or AI, there are already elements here that anticipate what makes a generative language model like ChatGPT work. For example, the use of random choice from each word list to produce variety in Strachey's program is similar to the way that a generative language model randomizes its selection of the next token in a sequence so that its outputs seem less predictable, more natural. Randomization is important for both. Even this fairly limited structure of Strachey's program can produce something on the order of 3 times 10 to the 39th power of love letter outputs, if my math is right. Such a large number that you could output one unique letter per second for billions of years without a repetition. So you might think of this program as a small, very small language model that can produce all sorts of variety. On the other hand, Strachey's work also points us to theories like Roland Barthes and to poetry of the sort we read earlier, where we think about creativity and expression not in terms of inventing something out of nothing, but in terms of reworking, collaging, and appropriating text that already exists. The love letter generator offers a literal machine made of words, and it helps to illustrate the logic of recombination through which poets like Alatalo and Smith produce new work. Strachey's program produces a tissue of quotations in the direct sense that it's drawing words and phrases from a few lists in new combinations. But it's also engaged in a broader practice of quotation in the sense that the program appeals to our own membership in an interpretive community, one that knows what a love letter is, what kind of structure a love letter should have, what sorts of words it should contain. So I think of Strachey's project as connecting these theories and practices of writing by appropriation with the history of computing and recent developments in computer-generated language. Seeing that it's getting late, I will, just go ahead into this last section about Jacob Gabriel's work. I wanted to conclude with Gabriel's article on the love letter generator, both because it gives a nice explanation of Strachey's program itself and because it provides some interesting context and interpretation. Gabriel begins not with Strachey, but with his more famous colleague, Alan Turing, whom he identifies as the most prominent queer subject in the history of computing. Turing is widely and correctly regarded as the inventor of modern computer science. As I've mentioned, he was gay and he was prosecuted for indecency and died not long after, apparently by suicide. Probably some of you heard of the Turing test, which Turing famously proposed as an experiment to help answer the question whether a machine, such as a computer, can think. Gabriel offers a summary of the test as Turing imagines it. A human interrogator submits written questions to 2 unknown contestants. One is a computer and the other is a woman. They both submit typed responses to each question. If the computer can convince the interrogator that it, and not the other contestant, is the woman, then the computer wins and qualifies as thinking. Gabriel points out first that Turing's definition of thinking here is based on performance. It's not about consciousness or genuine knowledge, but purely about the effectiveness of what it writes down. And second, Gabriel follows other scholars in pointing out that gender plays a central role in the Turing test. Over the years, people have simplified the test to ask whether a computer can just pass as human. But in its original form, the test is based on a parlor game with 2 human contestants, and the goal is to guess their genders. So in Turing's original version, the human contestant is a woman, and the computer's job is not just to act like a human, but to act like a woman. So Gabriel quotes Patricia Fancher saying, for the Turing test, quote, machine intelligence is like a man pretending to be a woman, end quote. The performance-oriented definition of intelligence here gets linked with the performative nature of gender. This link opens questions not just about machine intelligence, but about the nature of human identity, intelligence in our brains, right, and emotion. Gabriel then turns to Christopher Strachey, pointing out that in the same years that Turing was doing this work just described, Strachey was writing some unusual programs. In addition to solving math problems with his computer, which most of his peers were also doing, Strachey also wrote games and made computer music and art. Gabry calls works of this kind the hallmarks of humanity, since they're about creativity, invention, and yes, emotion as well. Here again, we can see Strachey's work as a very early step towards some of the things that large AI models can do today. Current AI platforms excel in new ways at generating language, illustrations, and other artistic materials that we normally think of as the hallmarks of humanity, as the purview of human intelligence. Getting to the core of his argument, Gabry makes three connected points about the love letter generator. First, he argues that Strachey's program underscores the formulaic nature of love letters and of love itself. As he writes on 173, quote, "The queerness of these letters is their disclosure that what seems rich and specific, the sincerity of romantic love, is perhaps entirely generic," end quote. This formulation reminds me of Stanley Fish's points about genre and interpretive communities, about how much shared knowledge we all have that makes our social interactions possible, and also of Fish's claim that we as subjects are similarly shaped by social forces. When I teach this Gabry essay, I like to illustrate this point by sort of making fun of myself and of all the incredibly obvious things I do to show affection for my partner. I write her love notes on our anniversary, buy her flowers, we go out on dates. All of these practices are supposed to function as sincere expressions of our very specific and personal love, but in fact, they're incredibly generic practices, right? They're so predictable and obvious. It's like what everybody does. There's a profoundly formulaic aspect to courtship and love, just as there is in Strachey's love letters. You'll recall this is what Fish tells us about how we interpret not only poems, but a lot of what we experience. Gabry's next point is to suggest that it's not only the equipment of courtship that is formulaic, but the structure of emotions themselves. Just as Turing reduces intelligence to performance, on 173, Gabry writes that Strachey's program, quote, exposes the thinness of normative romantic expression, pointing out the impersonality of affect. Rather than hold out romantic love as something inherently human and outside of simulation, Strachey's program follows Turing's own provocation, suggesting that the Turing test itself may be viewed as an exercise in the impersonality of humanness, end quote. So a statement like this might sound at first like bad news. It seems to diminish precisely those things that make us most human, our creativity, the authenticity and individuality of our emotional experiences. But it's worth remembering how queer folks like Turing and Strachey had no choice but to see the normative structures of social and romantic life as formulaic and arbitrary, rather than authentic and natural, because these structures excluded them and their desires. Furthermore, and this is Gabry's final and most challenging point, it may be possible to see the very flimsiness, the sort of cute formulaic nature of love as an object of humor and delight and celebration, rather than feeling it as loss. This is what Gabry's suggestive words on camp at the end of the essay are gesturing towards. I don't want to suggest that all the poems we've read solicit a camp response, but Gabry's note on camp gives us a nice place to end the session, partly because he shows us that our creative mechanisms, our word machines, may be in various ways formulaic and recycled and unoriginal, but nonetheless, they can occasion real emotional intensity, whether it's delight or humor or even love. So there's a lot more to say here, and I did have like very few concluding remarks, which is a lucky thing because I see we're almost out of time. So I think I'll just stop myself there, and maybe there's time to address a question or two.
Okay, good deal. And we will be fine. There are two questions, and we'll allot the time for those questions. And if you would like to give your final comments after those questions, I think we'll be fine. And thank you again, Seth. We really appreciate you. Marcella's question is this: how complex does a poet's input into a machine have to be, or how many changes must they make for you to consider the resulting poem still essentially human-made?
I think that's a very good question. I think I would like push back on the idea of drawing a definitive line between what's sort of human-made and what's technological. I think we work, part of what makes us humans is that we work with technologies, including just the basic technology of writing. So in this sense, I almost think that any poem is technological, and any technology is sort of human made. It's very hard to police that line in a decisive way, I think.
Okay. All right. The next question. Turing's performative view of intelligence is, of course, usually regarded as behaviorist, and behaviorism has no place for inferiority or subjectivity, which you called. In response to my last question, the what's it like to be quality of a person, do you personally follow the performative view of intelligence into behaviorism, or do you prefer to uphold subjectivity and see Turing's view as an external description of intelligence rather than its inner nature?
That's a great question. I mean, I personally am not a behaviorist, in part because I do think it's important to recognize that there is what it's like to be a person, and also that I think we ought to, when we talk about selfhood, subjectivity, consciousness, and knowledge, we should think in those terms. We should recognize that the qualitative aspect of being a person is important. I will say, though, that Turing, when he designed the test, he designed it as a way of punting on the question of whether a computer could actually think. He says, instead of actually answering the question whether a machine could think, let's just see about this weird parlor game. And I do think one of the really wild things about ChatGPT and similar technologies today is that we see that actually things, maybe our ways of interacting with technology really do change when we have a machine that really decisively passes the Turing test. I don't think I have to believe that ChatGPT is conscious in order to believe that it's again passing a behavioral test and thus doing something functionally with language. That's really different. Yeah, that's a great question.
Right. Thank you. And Anjali has several questions. I'll select one. He points out the difference between Dim Lady and Sonnet 130. And his question is why Sonnet 130? Why Sonnet 130 is sonnet, and why Dim Lady is a poem? Maybe this is mere semantics, but why Dim Lady cannot be called a sonnet as well? That's the question from Anjali.
That's great. Traditionally, a sonnet is a poem written in verse. That is, there are line breaks, and it specifically is a verse form having 14 lines and 10 syllables per line. There are two different common rhyme schemes. One is an Italian or Petrarchan sonnet, and the other is an English or Shakespearean sonnet. The line schemes differ, but not the number of lines and their lengths. I think, Dim Lady is not a sonnet because it's written in prose. There are no line breaks. I will say, though, that there's a long tradition of sort of experimenting with sonnet structures because it's such a famous form, thanks in part to the many sonnets of William Shakespeare. So there are some that might say, well, it's a sonnet just because it's associated with a Shakespeare sonnet. But in terms of the poetic form that the word sonnet designates, it just doesn't meet the formal definition.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. And Anjali, thank you for your questions. I see there are a few others there. But again, considering our time, we're going to move into our concluding remarks. Seth, you mentioned that you had some additional thoughts you wanted to share, and I think we'll be fine on time if you want to go ahead and share those.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a super lengthy conclusion. As I said at the outset, I wanted to select texts that bring together a variety of my recent activities, both in teaching and research, under the umbrella of this analogy of poems as machines, which, again, might seem like an odd way to think about form and language if you're reading a sonnet by William Shakespeare, but I hope the essays by Bart and Fish and the poems provided a more concrete sense of what we gain by thinking about writing as a technology that we share. In turning to Strachey's love letters, we get a sense of the very real technological history behind generative writing machines. I haven't said much about the two optional resources included in the seminar, both of which are more directly about current AI. There's so much interest in and anxiety about large AI models among humanities teachers these days that it seemed worth providing some resources that would speak more directly to that issue. My short article from PMLA tries to cover a lot of ground, but hopefully provides some suggestive ideas about how large AI models might affect humanities research and teaching. And the video from this online educator named called 3 Blue 1 Brown is really a technical explainer. I have watched several videos explaining how large AI model works from a technical standpoint, and I really think this one is the best. It's detailed, but also really clear. It definitely gets into the weeds with some of the technical details, but in general, I think it's a really clear, even for those who are not great with computers or math. Given that I think large AI models are basically guaranteed to have some really profound effects on many dimensions of our lives, including how we teach and maybe how we read and write poems, I think it's a great idea to have a sort of a basic but specific understanding about how these technologies work. There is some misunderstanding and misinformation out there, so I encourage you to check out this video. Instead of spending all our time on these AI issues, though, I wanted to offer some broader context from multiple domains, right? From theory, poetry, and media history. And I hope some of these materials will stay with you and maybe be useful to you in your own teaching. So with that, I'll just say thank you again for your time, everyone. And if there are further questions, I'm happy to stick around.
Good deal. And again, thank you. During my opening remarks, I mentioned that I have been very much looking forward to this time. I know your time is precious, but thank you so much for just spending your evening with us, for sharing your expertise with us. To our teachers who are here, I believe we had close to 900 or so in attendance tonight, and I'm sure they all enjoyed it. And this video will be available on demand, kept within our webinar archive. So for those who are interested in coming back and pausing and listening and taking additional notes, these will be available. And of course, the resources will be available as well. And
thank you again so much. And thanks everyone for joining.
Absolutely. And just based on the closing comments, I feel like there's some additional work and another webinar to follow in the seasons to come. So thank you for that. We encourage you all to follow us at nationalhumanitiescenter.org and on our social media channels for all the happenings, programming, public programs, education events, public engagement events as well that are going on at the National Humanities Center. And again, I encourage you all to support the humanities education programs. NHC education programs, as I mentioned before, we are a private nonprofit, but we provide a bridge between the academic world and the working classroom. Your gift, no matter how modest, can open up a world of ideas for teachers and rekindle their enthusiasm for the subjects they teach. So if you're so inclined, please consider supporting the National Humanities Center. Our next webinar is actually January 23rd. We had a webinar scheduled for January 14th. You'll be receiving updates about it. It is being postponed. That webinar is with Zoe Wheel. Zoe will not be available. She actually will be traveling to India at that time. And so we spoke with her about rescheduling that. That being said, we will have Michael Robert Blackie, Associate Professor, Department of Medical Education, University of Illinois, Chicago, who will be leading a session on January 23rd after you return from your much-needed holiday break. The Health Humanities from the Clinic to the Classroom, which is scheduled for January 23rd, and that should be 2025 at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. We look forward to having you all here. This is our final webinar for the calendar year, but we will be back in the spring with a strong slate of webinars. And so please stay tuned. There will be some new additions to the webinar series too. So those who are looking for additional salary credit hours, we will be adding at least 2 more webinars to our spring lineup, and the announcements will come out about those. Continue to do the great things that you're doing in your classrooms. As you very well know, we here at the Center are so appreciative of all that you're doing on the ground for our students around the country and our world. So again, thank you all for joining us this evening. If I can assist with anything, please do not hesitate to reach out to me, mwilliams@nationalhumanitiescenter.org. Take care and be well.